Hello and welcome to Please Don't Eat the Sage Season 2. Today's guest is the epitome of the millennial witch. As the author of a young adult trilogy about 90s obsessed witches and a freelance writer for many of the magazines I've loved since my teens, her resume reads like a fictional character from a 90s witch comedy. Even more admirable, though, is her relaxed and attainable approach to everyday magic. So if you've ever wondered how you're supposed to cast a witchy magical spell when you don't even know what lungwort is, stay tuned. All right, so welcome to this week's episode of Please Don't Eat the Sage. This week I'm super excited for my guest. Kate Williams has written for 17, Nylon, Cosmopolitan, Bustle, Vans, Calvin Klein, Urban Outfitters, and many other brands and magazines. But more importantly, she is the author of the Babysitters Coven trilogy, which includes the Babysitters Coven, For Better or Cursed, and Spells Like Teen Spirit. So if the titles of those books don't give you somewhat of an idea of why she's on my podcast during the season that we're talking about being a baby witch, and also while I'm promoting my 90s themed Total Betty Goddess deck, you clearly need a history in 90s history. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you again.
We've had an interview before. I think we did an Instagram Live.
Yeah.
I don't think people do that as much anymore. So I'm happy to have you in a format that I can edit later if I need to, and that there's not as many live glitches, hopefully. But yeah, it's very good to see you again. And I just want to dive in right away and get to the meat of it because again, I'm talking to people this season because I'm kind of just starting dipping my toe in like actually calling myself a witch and being more traditional with my witchy practices, like the things that you would think of from like 90s movies as witchcraft. Before that, I called myself a magic maker, and I kind of like dabbled in things that I felt were magical, but not necessarily witchy. And it was mostly just because I didn't feel like I could own that title. There was no judgment around it. I was just like, well, I'm not going to call myself something that I'm not fully embodying. So what do you refer to yourself as far as a magic maker, witch? Like, what is your comfortable terminology around how you create magic in your life?
I mean, I would probably say at this point, witch. You know, it's very interesting. Like you say, you have to work up to becoming comfortable with that term. I definitely felt like a very similar path with like calling myself a writer. Even after I'd written several books, I wouldn't say I'm writing a book. I'd say I'm working on a book project, you know, because it seemed so much less serious and less like high reaching, kind of similar to me for like witchcraft. You know, I never used that term with myself, and I didn't really consider how much I knew until I like would take these classes, and I'd be really frustrated because I was like, oh, I know everything, you know, that is being taught to me by now. And like, I've been reading books on magic for 25 years, you know. I think you sometimes have to kind of take a step back and see yourself from the outside to be like, no, this is a space that I am not only comfortable in, but that I'm also knowledgeable in, and that I am able to use this word unselfconsciously at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa Lister has a great book that's like Witch Untamed. I never can remember all the subtitles, but she breaks down like the different types of witches, like green witch, kitchen witch, eclectic witch. Like, is there a certain witch that you identify more as?
I mean, I think definitely like hearth witch. You know, I feel like a lot of my practice is kind of centered around, for lack of a better word, housekeeping and, you know, creating a safe space. So I live in Kansas now. We have like a 4-bedroom house. Before that, we lived in San Francisco in like a 2-bedroom apartment where like all of our stuff was in storage, and I didn't even have a desk. And, you know, when we made that decision to do that move, like I didn't think it was that big of a deal. And then, you know, I spent a year and a half living in this place that just had no feeling, didn't feel like, you know, home. And like, I'm kind of a bit of nomad isn't the right word, but I've hopped around a lot, like you were saying with apartments. So I'm at home very easily, but I definitely started to miss like having my books and having my little trinkets. And so that's kind of where I am a lot now. And it's very interesting when you talked about like calling yourself a witch versus a magic maker. I too have kind of gone that gamut. You know, I think for a while I was like, oh, I'm interested in like ceremonial magic, you know, and then I've kind of like come back around to something that I feel like is a lot more like natural to me and is a lot easier for me to kind of weave it throughout the life that I'm already living, as opposed to setting aside this chunk of time where it's like, and now I practice magic, So I think that, that's kind of been an interesting realization for me.
I love that. First of all, I totally relate to the needing the trinkets in the books as
Yeah.
a Cancer sun sign and someone who also moved across the country and
Yeah.
then back across the country. I totally know what you're talking about. And I've done the opposite in that I've become very accustomed to setting up house as quickly as
Yeah.
possible. So even if I'm just there for like a brief amount of time, it already feels like home the
Mhm.
second that I'm there, because I feel like that's so much better than just like riding it out until you get to the next place.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
It's like then that limbo period feels like limbo. So
Yeah, exactly.
and I also love that it's kind of just it sounds like it's a natural integration into your
Mhm.
lifestyle rather than like a segregated portion of it.
Mhm.
So what are some things that you consider sort of your magical rituals around the home?
I mean, I love to make things. I love to cook and I love to do crafts. And I had this like realization recently about feminine magic and masculine magic, and kind of just seeing how men and women were drawn to different types. And, again, like ceremonial magic, like I was talking about, like this thing that is like carved out in this very, delineated space. Like to me, that's very male, because men have always had the luxury of having, being able to go off and do their intellectual pursuits.
Yeah.
Whereas like women kind of had to figure out a way to do it while taking care of the household and taking care of children and doing things like that. For me, it's like I consider decorating for the holidays like very much a magical practice, because again, it's that wheel of the year and you're like honoring the passage of time and the changing of the seasons. And, I love to make holiday decorations, like I love to make like little things for Halloween and things for Christmas, and kind of really lean into that, whatever time of year it is. I have in our dining room, we have this old pump organ that is kind of like my seasonal altar. It's like I don't put magical stuff there, but it's like I have a poster that I change out for the seasons, and that's where I put all of my little like holiday decorations. And like right now it's in the middle of summer and my son's out of school, so that's where I've been putting like all of his crafts. And so that's kind of a big one. And then, just like cooking, where you're literally like creating something that nourishes like yourself and the people that you love, and like blessing the food and being, giving thanks to the plants and animals who prepared it for us. And yoga has been a big part of my magical practice lately, because again, like I've been really thinking about how I spent a lot of my life thinking that I couldn't really do what I needed to do to feel good and take care of myself, because that seemed like such an extravagance. It's like we're supposed to burn out. We're supposed to be like running around busy. And now I'm like, no, like I want to go to yoga 5 times a week, and I want to make that a priority. And I want to make people in my life shift their schedule so that that's possible for me. And again, it's like, if you think of magic as claiming power, then there are a lot of different ways that you can employ magic in your life that is not kind of like what we would think of as magic.
I love that. First of all, this podcast is named for multiple meanings, but one of them is like, please don't eat the sage, kind of like, please don't drink the Kool-Aid, and like, don't assume that magic has to be like this cult-like practice. And so that's kind of what I'm constantly trying to break down with these conversations in these episodes, is the idea that it's all about intention. Like, because literally everything you described was something that people that are not interested at all in magic do all the time.
Yeah.
Like, and you literally were just describing anyone's holiday, the rituals and like practices. And I think that that's an important thing to point out for both sides. And that like, if you're intimidated by magic and witchcraft and you think it's like this evil, weird thing, it's just putting intention behind everything that everyone always does. And then if you're intimidated because you want to do magic and you don't know how to start, literally take making your morning coffee in the morning and turn it into a magical ritual. I think and I think yoga, I love that you mentioned yoga, because I feel like yoga was my gateway drug to that thought process. And so I went very naturally from being a yogi and being a yoga instructor to setting intentions for things. And again, being a magic maker, essentially being a witch, but not feeling comfortable with that title just yet. And so I think that that's beautiful. What do you think is it that centers you into your intention? the best?
I think for me, just like awareness. And I recently came to the awareness that I am ADHD, and, I'm 43. And it was kind of like I read a book about it, thinking it would help me understand people that are in my life. And then it was just like, oh my God, I'm reading about myself. And, that awareness kind of helped me to kind of get a little bit of a distance and really see the way that my mind has worked my entire life, where it's just been like going, because I felt like that was how I needed to be and just like how I was.
A very similar experience with autism, and that I just recently self-diagnosed that. And it was the same thing. Like I just read a book about it and I was like, wait, this isn't how everybody functions.
Yeah,
like
exactly,
I just thought this is how everyone's mind works. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, for me, it's been very, I don't like the word empowerment, but it has been very empowering, because it has allowed me to kind of recognize that that's happening and realize that I don't have to act on it, kind of like setting the intention to like pay attention, slow down, and kind of push away this like cultural conditioning that I've been kind of operating on under my entire life. I've been listening to like a lot of lectures recently, and I listened to this one by this like Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfield, and he had a quote in it where something like, each time we pay attention, we get a little more empty. And I was thinking about that because it's like, we're so often just so full. We have so many things going on in our head. We are so full that we don't have room to take in anything else. Mm-hmm. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, that each time I slow down and pay attention, which is intention, to what I am doing and how I want to feel, it creates a little more space within me to actually feel that.
So I think switching gears from the intention into the magic portion of things, one of my favorite things about your books, which I have here in front of me, for those of you on the video element, beautiful pastel, everything a 90s girl wants. I'm almost done with book 3. It's taken me forever, but it's also been, anytime I reach for something for pleasure reading, it has been your books.
Oh, that's great.
So, I mean, it's taken me a very long time to get through it, but I can tell you that if I'm like, I just don't feel like reading like the stuff that I've been reading, I'm like, I'm not reading the Babysitters Coven. So I'm almost through book 3, but I love that the characters to give listeners just a little brief overview, it's kind of, a lot of people have described it as Buffy meets the Babysitters Club. And that's, I think, a perfect combination, because it is a coven of sitters who have special magical powers. So I love that their spells are, let's just talk a little bit about the spells in these books, because they're basically everyday items that you can find. Just tell me your inspiration behind some of that.
Well, it's so funny because someone actually sent me a funny like witch talk TikTok today where, someone was making a spell out of a hot dog, and they were like, this is modern witchcraft. It's not all henbane and eye of newt. Sometimes it's just like, cold cuts and lavender. But again, it's like, you look throughout history, and it's a lot of these things that we think of as traditional spell ingredients seem very exotic and strange to us now because our lifestyles have changed so much. But again, it's like, you look at witchcraft was essentially a practice of using what was around you and imbibing it with magical intention. So it's like people were casting spells using what they had that was available to them because it was done out of necessity. And you think about, it's like, okay, you need to cast a spell. Like, do you have 3 weeks to order something off the internet and then wait for it to arrive? It's like, you don't. So just thinking about how, the tradition of how spell ingredients were sourced, what would spells look like, in 2022 if they were built off of what a teenage girl had available. Yeah. And it's so funny, you asked like earlier, like what kind of witch? And it's like, I'm like, well, clearly I'm a trinket witch, and like, that's like, I think a lot of people who are, a lot of women who are drawn to witchcraft, it starts as a teenage girl. You're like, I'll take this crystal and I'll take this incense and I'll take this tiny thing and tiny thing and tiny thing. And it's like my life is still like a wash in like tiny things, so it's like, how do you use those tiny things and like mix them all together?
I mean, that answer makes me love it even more, because I love it just because it's just quirky and interesting, but also makes sense to the characters. And then the fact that you kind of thought about it from this like historical perspective, because you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I don't have mugwort on hand, but if I'm living in like whatever, like 16th century, like you're going to have herbs on hand. That's going to
because you're foraging and it's like,
yeah, that makes total sense. Oh, I love that. We both lived in LA. Did we live in LA at the same time? I don't think we lived in LA.
I don't think we did,
Yeah, but we both had a stint in LA, and you recently went back and kind of explored some things that you didn't get to explore lately. And you were telling me a little bit about a little magical elements to that trip. So let's talk a little bit about the Bell Book and Candle, right?
Yeah. So Bell Book and Candle is one of those things I didn't even know about it when I lived in LA, and I discovered it through Instagram. There is this woman, Pleasant Gehman, who was kind of a seminal figure in like the late 70s LA punk scene. Like, she's just like this awesome woman who's done a little bit of everything. She's a witch and a tarot reader, and she's also been a belly dancer for decades. And so she and a couple of other women put on this monthly occult burlesque night. And it has a different theme every month, and they do like a group ritual. And so the dates aligned so that I was able to go the last time I was in LA. And it was honestly like, it was hands down like the most clean cut good time that I've had in a very long time. Like, it was just like, everyone was laughing, and it was also like, it, felt very like meaningful. I can't remember what the theme was the time that I went, but one of the performers did a whole burlesque routine as Lucy Westerna from Dracula. But the whole time she just had like, blood that was dripping out of her mouth, and she would pretend to be like really embarrassed, but she'd like wipe it away. And by the time she was done, she was like totally covered in blood. And it was a really, really good time.
I love that. I'm a former burlesque dancer, so I do enjoy hearing about other routines, but I love that there's like a ritual element. What was the ritual for?
So the ritual was, I went in January, so it was like a New Year's ritual. They had people write on cards what you wished for everyone at that event to have in the new year. And then it was a blood sacrifice. So the woman, like, she took all the pieces of paper and like stapled them to herself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was pretty
definitely
intense,
theatrical.
It was very intense. Yeah. I felt like afterwards I was like reading more about it, and I guess that's actually like an old burlesque trick, which doesn't make it any less intense. It is still a staple thing going into flesh, but is something that people used to do for like gas money, where people would come up and like staple dollar bills and
oh wow,
currencies them. Yeah,
I'm gonna go on a Google rabbit hole on that later. That's interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, and maybe burlesque isn't necessarily like more of like a slideshow. Vaudeville trick. Yeah.
So the Babysitters Coven is complete. It is a trilogy. And then you have a book that came out as your little summer beach read. Do you want to talk a little bit about
Never Coming Home?
Yes, Never Coming Home. Yeah.
So that was my modern retelling of Agatha Christie's, and then there were none. So it was kind of inspired by that, and Fire Festival, which was the music festival that turned out to be a disaster, and then got all of these influencers like marooned on a desert island.
I love that combination.
Yeah. So it was a really, really fun book to write.
I understand. I understand why you've been talking about it being a good beach read, because that does. Yeah. I want to go sit at the beach and read that now. So that'll be when I finish this trilogy that I've been working on for a while. Yeah. Your book's going to be the next one I pick up. Yeah. Anything else you've got going on? Just settling in with your Hearth Witch tendencies and
well, I am kind of switching gears. I am currently working on a nonfiction book that'll come out in 2024, and it's called How to Stop Trying, and it's kind of a self-help book / essay collection that means basically like a rejection of like empowerment and hustle culture, which is something that, especially if you're female, has been shoved down your throat for the past decade. Very much like, not only you can have it all, but you should have it all. Like, you should do whatever it takes to make your dreams come true. And yeah, this book is kind of just like dismantling of that, and hopefully offering new narratives and new ways of looking at what success means, so that it's not so much about like accomplishment and external markers. Because I think that we're kind of having, I think there's definitely like a wake up happening now, where people are, we're in the midst of a mental health crisis, basically a mental health crisis and a burnout crisis.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
people are like, we can't keep living how we have been living. But I think that takes more than just like self-care. And I think, our culture loves to add things on. We love to be like, oh, well, you can keep working 60 hours a week and trying to raise your kids and do this and this and this, and just take these adaptogens, and it's like, that doesn't work. And so it's like, I think, the way forward is like scaling back and rethinking how we live and, our expectations of ourselves. So it's been I'm really, really excited about it.
I love that even though you're obviously not writing this as a witchcraft book, it perfectly ties back to the concept that we were talking about earlier about the ritual and the intention setting being a way to slow down and like really notice what's important. So like they kind of go hand in hand. So if there's any witches that are struggling with that part of the process.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because the book was really it was sparked by my experience with fertility. I have a 5-year-old son, and after him I had 3 miscarriages, like over the space of 3 years, like in the midst of the pandemic. My family had a bunch of other stuff going on, and my husband and I just eventually decided like we were going to stop trying. And like that didn't mean that we didn't want it, and that didn't mean that it was sad. It just meant that we were no longer essentially going to sacrifice what we had and our present happiness for this idea that like we could somehow be happier in the future. When I was going through that, like I was really surprised like how rarely or how few examples of that narrative that I could find, not just with fertility, but with anything, where it's like, hey, you know what, this thing that you wanted that you're not going to get, you're going to be okay. That like your life is still worthwhile if you're not meeting your goals. Your life is still worthwhile if it's not the life of your dreams. And so that was kind of like the experience that kind of prompted me to want to write this book. But it's also really interesting because like, my miscarriages and my fertility problems were what brought me back to magic at this point in my life, because it's like, I didn't know like how else to make sense of that. And, it was really like, I can easily, track the two of them together, because it was like, for a long time, my magic was about getting something. I was like, let me get pregnant. Let me have this other baby, this other baby. Like, I was like invoking goddesses and doing spells and like making spell jars and putting them under the bed, but all with this idea of like, I was going to get something out of it.
Yeah.
And then you have this whole thing of you're like, well, the magic didn't fucking work, and then it's like you kind of go to the other side where you're like, okay, that's not what it's about, and magic is really, it's about like trusting in something bigger than yourself, which is again not something that our culture is really comfortable with.
Yeah, it is. It's about, it's a faith, and I like to compare like witchcraft and any faith-based like practice. Like even though they don't always play well together, they're all doing the same thing and absolutely. With the same intention. And I think that that's a very good message that I love that we're kind of like wrapping things up on, because I also have had that realization recently where it's like trying to like strive for the goal rather than the experience or the centeredness or that inner knowing, because you can have that inner sense of knowing that you ultimately get from these practices without actually getting to the goal that you thought that you needed, but because you have this centeredness, wherever you end up is exactly where you want to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, Kate, we're going to wrap up the interview portion of this podcast. If you are a new listener listening to this episode, what we do is we have a little mini episode with all of the people that I interview where we pull a card from the Total Betty Goddess deck, the 2.0 edition, which is my 90s goddess deck that I've created. And we're going to talk about not only the meaning of Kate's card, but also the 90s icon that's going to be playing her goddess. So if you are interested in that episode, stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for listening. Find out more about Kate by following her on Instagram at HeyKateWilliams, or check out her writing on Substack, heykatewilliams.substack.com. And stay tuned this Thursday for her Total Betty Goddess reading, where we bond over our mutual affection for the 90s. This episode of Please Don't Eat the Sage was brought to you in part by my Patreon members. So I'd like to thank Ashley, Laura, Caitlin, Amanda, and Karen. If you'd like to join their ranks, you can do so over at patreon.com/Michelle Shea. You can also support this podcast by pre-ordering your own copy of the Total Betty Goddess deck, or head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review.